Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series. It is great to see that so many of you have joined us, both here in the Mandela Auditorium at UNC-Chapel Hill and online via Zoom. Our distinguished guest today is North Korea expert, Dr. Sung-Yoon Lee. I will introduce him to you in a minute. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at UNC-Chapel Hill. I've been running the Krasno event series for quite some time now, but we are still going strong. Today, we are talking about what is going on in North Korea and what is going on in the ruling Kim family. And we are also talking about how we view this dangerous country and its weird leaders, and if we get it wrong, or perhaps we get it right. Our event is entitled, How Dangerous is North Korea? 5 Myths about the Ultra-Strange Despotic State. Our distinguished guest will give a talk about this topic, and he and I will then have a little conversation, and I try to interrogate our guests about North Korea. And we will get many insights about the situation in North Korea. There's no one better to explain the complex situation in North Korea than our guest today, who himself grew up in South Korea, Professor Sung-Yoon Lee. Sung-Yoon Lee is a scholar of Korean and East Asian studies and a specialist on North Korea. He was a long-standing professor of Korean history and US East Asian relations at the Fletcher School of Tufts University in Boston. He also is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Dr. Lee has written on the politics of the Korean Peninsula for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, CNN, Foreign Affairs, and many, many others. He has also testified several times as an expert witness to the US House of Representatives, and he has advised senior leaders, including the President of the United States and the Chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Yoon Lee is the author of The Sister, The Extraordinary Story of Kim Yo-jong, North Korea's most powerful woman. And here is a book. And I would like to, on behalf of Dr. Lee, I would encourage you to buy and purchase the book and read it. It actually is a good read. It's not a dry scholarly tome, but it is a very good and entertaining read, as much as North Korea can be entertaining, I would say. So get it and rush to Amazon.com or to the local bookstore and get it. The book was published by PanMacmillan in the United Kingdom and by Public Affairs in the United States and Canada. So far, it has been translated into 11 languages. The book has been extremely well reviewed, has been selected as one of the best books of 2023, and PanMacmillan has even named it among the 50 best autobiographies and biographies of all time. This is indeed high praise. It is thus a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Lee to UNC-Chapel Hill. Yoon and I actually met at the Wilson Center in DC last year, and I could not pass up on the great opportunity to ask him and to come and talk to us. Before Dr. Lee makes his remarks, and I then pepper him with some questions, let me just point out that as always, we are videotaping our event today. It will be published on our famous YouTube channel for eternity. So if you want to watch it several times over after this event, this is quite possible. The address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. We have a great international audience today, and everyone is most welcome to submit your questions to our speaker today by either raising your hand if you are in the auditorium today, or by making use of the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our Krasno assistants will select your questions and read them out aloud to all of us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sung-Yoon Lee to the Krasno Global Event Series here at UNC-Chapel Hill to talk about the dangerous situation in North Korea. You're welcome.
Thank you for that overly generous introduction. You have managed to make a grown man go red in the face, blush in embarrassment. I'm really delighted, honored to be here. This is my first ever visit to UNC-Chapel Hill, but at the risk of never being invited back, may I start with a truly bizarre assertion, statement, and then follow it up with a rather serious grammatical error. The weird assertion: I believe truly that the North Korean dictator, Kim Jong-un, is by far the most famous Korean individual around the world, outside the Korean Peninsula, outside the region, East Asia, ever. There is no other Korean person who is more widely recognized by name and photograph, face, as the North Korean leader. And those of you familiar with K-pop, BTS might be thinking, no, BTS is more famous. No, 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 they don't even come close. And I can even prove it. According to a Pew Research survey a couple of years ago, asking Americans to identify various world leaders, almost 90% of Americans could identify Kim Jong-un as the dictator of North Korea, whereas when it came to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, about 60% or less, and so on. So Kim Jong-un is truly notorious for all the wrong reasons, and this has implications, policy implications. Because North Korea, the cult of personality, this claim that the supreme leader is almost a demigod who is infallible, who is the world's greatest thinker, philosopher, composer, and so on, because they make so many outrageous assertions, remarks, we tend to laugh at them. North Korea's cult of personality is endlessly risible, mockable. If there were such a thing as an international mockability index, North Korea would reign supreme as #1, perhaps forever. So we tend to underestimate North Korea. We tend to patronize the ultra-weird supreme leader of North Korea. We don't take them seriously. We think they're very brittle, very sensitive. Be a bit nicer, be a bit more generous. Maybe they'll comply. Maybe they'll part their ways with nuclear weapons. Such mentality, such attitudinal deficiency has run through our attitude and our approach to North Korea for decades. The serious grammatical error, and I say this quite often, and every time I see my primary Church of England school grammar teacher in London wincing in shame, but here it is. North Korea, ladies and gentlemen, is uniquely unique. And my teacher would say, didn't I teach you unique is an absolute adjective? It can't be more or less unique. But they're so different. And you might say, well, every individual is unique. Every nation state is unique in many different ways. True. But North Korea is really different. It is the world's first and only communist system that has implemented a father-to-son succession. First, in 1994, when the founder died and Kim Jong-il, the father of the current leader, took over. And then again, when Kim Jong-il himself died in 2011, Kim Jong-un, the current leader, assumed power. What's the problem there? Well, communism rails against such father-to-son privileges, bloodline, heritage, aristocracy, monarchy, but they do it because power must remain within this cultish clan, within the family. Another unique aspect is that North Korea is, according to the United Nations, the world's most serious, the worst violator of human rights. 10 years ago, the United Nations Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea, a 400-page, 373-page long report on human rights violations, made the serious allegation, quote, the nature, scale, and gravity of North Korea's human rights violations reveal a state that has no parallel in the contemporary world. No parallel in the contemporary world, simply the worst. And that report documents in meticulous detail North Korea's manifold crimes against humanity, like, for example, quote, a policy of deliberate mass starvation, a policy of deliberate mass starvation, end quote. Quote, knowingly causing prolonged starvation, knowingly causing prolonged starvation, end quote. And you must be thinking, what kind of regime would intentionally starve, kill a portion of its population? It must be due to negligence or incompetence. Can't be deliberate. A policy of deliberate mass starvation. Later on, if you're interested, I'd like to expand on that a bit. Other unique aspects of North Korea? Well, North Korea, by certain metrics, has the world's biggest standing army. Certainly proportional to its population size, its defense spending is the biggest. They spend anywhere between 25 to 30% of their national income on the military. They have the world's fourth largest standing army for a nation of 25 million people. It's extraordinary. 1.2 million men. Only after China, Russia, the United States, after that, it's North Korea in absolute figures. So it's a hyper-inflated military, and of course, military power is what makes North Korea relevant, significant, ominous in the world. By the conventional indices of measuring state power, economic power, the size of your land territory, the size of your population, soft power, there's none to speak of course, when it comes to soft power in North Korea. By all these indices, North Korea is far inferior to the other Korean state across the southern border, the Republic of Korea, one of the world's richest and most thriving democracies today. But when it comes to military power, we got to take North Korea seriously. When it comes to their capability and intentions, a regime that shows little to no regard for human life, including the lives of their own people, they are a serious nuclear-armed military power with a very, very high pain threshold when it comes to battle deaths, when it comes to waging war. They have an incomparable strategic advantage over democracies because they are such a despotic system. 1 million people die in war, no big deal, they'll be okay. Whereas in a democracy, that would cripple any elected leader. So North Korea is a small country, often risible, often laughable, but it is a serious threat to their own people. First of all, the regime is a serious and constant threat to the people of North Korea. North Korea, historians on the left and the right basically agree, is the most perfected, the most advanced totalitarian system the world has ever seen. Much more extreme than China under Chairman Mao or the Soviet Union under Stalin. The level of surveillance, intrusion in the private realm of the citizens is extraordinary. For example, to go from one town to this town to the next town over, you need to apply for a special travel permit at least 3 days ahead of time at the local police station. It is illegal to travel to the next town without proper documentation. The gulags, the political prisoner concentration camps. What kind of crimes are we talking about that would render the entire family of the defendant, including people, family members across 3 generations? So if your parents are still living, yes, they too are included. They are thrown into a gulag. If you have children, yes, they too. I mean, what kinds of crimes are we talking about? Well, complaining that life is hard, for example. Saying anything even remotely unflattering about the supreme leader, for example. Accidentally stepping on or sitting on a newspaper carrying a black and white photograph of the supreme leader, for example. If you are caught practicing religion, especially Christianity, yes, you will end up in a concentration camp. If you are a repeat offender, you will be executed in public. North Korea conducts routine, frequent public executions all throughout the land. And these are gruesome affairs into which children also are dragooned, pulled into watching, bearing witness, 5-year-olds, 4-year-olds. watching a public execution. It's a trauma that lasts forever in the psyche. And of course, the regime's intent is to instill deep fear in every citizen and to reinforce the message that we own you. You cannot defy us. You have to be obedient. So, in a nutshell, North Korea is an ultra weird, very cruel, inhumane regime that has serious intentions for the Korean Peninsula. We have to take North Korea seriously. The 5 myths I had in mind as I thought about my title, the title of my brief presentation today, well, let me go in order. First myth, if not for US hostile policy, and this is a stock phrase that North Korea has used for decades, US hostile policy, if not for US hostile policy, North Korea might dismantle its nuclear weapons, become more a conventional nation state, decrease the size of its military, and so on. I can't find any evidence to support that assertion, that view. Yes, the United States is a potential threat, even mortal threat to North Korea, but the facts are that since the signing of the ceasefire agreement, armistice, to the Korean War in 1953, there has not been a single case of a preemptive first attack by the United States against North Korea or by South Korea against North Korea. Quite the contrary. North Korea has launched, since 1953, thousands, over 3,000 small-scale attacks, sometimes very lethal, killing American soldiers in South Korea, stationed in Japan as well. At no time there was, even in the face of such egregious lethal attacks on Americans and South Koreans, there has never been a military retaliation for fear of escalation, for fear of another war breaking out in the Korean Peninsula. That kind of extraordinary self-restraint by the US and South Korea have maintained the de facto peace, no war since 1953, during which South Korea has risen as a thriving, affluent nation. But one has to admit at the same time, that kind of self-restraint has conditioned to North Korea to assume that it can walk away scot-free, that it can commit a murder, it can kill Americans and South Koreans and pay no price for it. So that is a reality. Even if the US or South Korea are generous, giving North Korea billions of dollars in aid, the United States alone gave North Korea $1.3 billion of aid between 1995 and 2008. So about $100 million a year. To put that in some context, during the year 2000, North Korea's total export earnings was about $500 million. So when you're receiving $100 million from the United States each year, when you're receiving much more than that, almost $1 billion from South Korea, all that is very helpful in building the bomb, for example. So yes, the US, South Korea, and other nations, the international community, have been very generous and friendly and not hostile toward North Korea repeatedly in the past, yet that did not deter North Korea from saying goodbye to their nuclear arsenal. Another myth is that, well, Kim Jong-un lived in Switzerland as a boy, unlike his father, who was never educated outside North Korea, Kim Jong-il, who died in 2011, who seldom traveled abroad. So, his worldview was rather limited, whereas the son, Kim Jong-un, when he assumed power in 2011, by virtue of having lived in Switzerland as a boy, maybe invoking Deng Xiaoping, the late Chinese paramount leader, who by virtue of having lived in France as a young man, studied in France for 4 years, as the myth goes, therefore became a reformer. Maybe Kim Jong-un would become a reformer. Such were optimistic prognostications in 2011, 2012. Well, for every Deng Xiaoping, there is a Pol Pot, who also lived in France, studied in France in his 20s for 4 years, but managed to kill about 1/3 of his own people. There is the Syrian dictator who studied medicine. He's an eye doctor, ophthalmologist who studied in England, but has managed to kill thousands, tens of thousands of his own people. So exposure to European cosmopolitanism is great, I had that privilege as a boy living in London and in Geneva when I was a young boy, but it is no guarantor of reform if you are the supreme leader of a cruel totalitarian system. I mentioned 5, but for the sake of time, let me wrap up my brief presentation so we can have a longer conversation. North Korea has a plan. North Korea has strategy. North Korea does not just go berserk and react to external stimuli, whether it's condemnation by the President of the United States, for example, former President George W. Bush, during his State of the Union address in 2002, mentioned that North Korea, along with Iraq and Iran, are an axis of evil. And that led to protestations, that led to rebuke from many of my colleagues here in the United States and in South Korea. Why demonize North Korea? They'll only be more belligerent. And yes, they were belligerent rhetorically and in practice as well. But they're not that sensitive. They can take it. They're not that brittle. They don't just go lash out or go crazy because somebody called them bad names. They're mature. They have a plan. For example, Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader, the founder of the North Korean state, on the eve of the massive invasion of South Korea, thus starting the Korean War on June 25th, 1950, at 4 a.m. on a Sunday, when it is the nadir of battle readiness, when hangover creeps in the barracks. On June 7th, Kim Il-sung proposed to the South Korean authorities, let's meet, talk about peace, and work toward forming a united inter-Korean North-South parliament. On the occasion of the 5th anniversary of liberation from Japanese colonial rule, which would have been August 15th, 1950. The colonial rule ended with Japan's defeat in the Second World War in August 1945, as we know. And then Kim Il-sung submitted another, far more detailed plan with a schedule and itinerary of meetings with South Korea on June 19th, 6 days before launching the massive systematic invasion of the South. What happened in the interim? What happened between June 19th and June 25th? He had a change of heart? Of course not. It's traditional strategic deception that they excel in. And just to give you a couple of more examples of their calculated provocations, the first nuclear test that North Korea conducted came on October 9th in 2006, when the Bush administration was politically mired in Iraq, when the Republican Party had lost over 30 seats in the election, and it was a good time for North Korea to paint the Bush administration into a corner. And then the next day, which is a major holiday, Party Founding Day, they had a big military parade and celebrated the first ever nuclear test. The second nuclear test was conducted on May 25th, 2009, which just happened to be Memorial Day in the United States, early in the Obama first presidency. The month before, they conducted the first long-range missile test in 3 years on April 5th, 2009, just hours before President Obama was to give his first major foreign policy speech while on a visit to Prague. It's not a coincidence. Third nuclear test was on February 12th, 2013, right in the middle of China's most important national holiday, Lunar New Year celebrations, the first for Xi Jinping as the paramount leader. And that was a message to the Chinese leader. Take me seriously. Don't patronize me. Don't underestimate me. And President Xi was rather irritated by that behavior, a nuclear test during Lunar New Year celebrations. So there are many other examples, dozens of such calculated provocations for maximum political pressure. July 4th, 2017, North Korea conducted its first ever intercontinental ballistic missile test, and then Kim Jong-un came out and explained that this is, quote, a special gift package for American bastards, end quote. That is the official English translation by the North Korean government, and that more such gift packages would be coming your way. And indeed, they conducted another ICBM test later in the same month. So North Korea, like terrorists, for example, have a keen sense of timing. You know, terrorists often strike in the morning. They attack in the morning. Not always, there are exceptions, of course. There are nighttime raids and terrorist attacks. But you create havoc in the morning. You have gruesome scenes of civilians killed, injured, panic-stricken faces, and such images are played over and over again throughout the day. Psychologically, that puts more pressure on your target nation, on the government. So North Korea is no joke. They're very clever. They have chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. We have to take them seriously and stop patronizing North Korea. And the rise of a powerful female figure in the personage of the sister of North Korea, Kim Yo-jong, this is an unprecedented phenomenon. And my basic argument in my humble book, The Sister, is that Kim Yo-jong and her brother, Kim Jong-un, since the onset of COVID, have played a very clever role reversal. When Kim Yo-jong visited South Korea for the Winter Olympics in February 2018, she wore a sunny disposition. She seemed polite, although she never made a statement to the press, to the South Korean people, just showed up, shook hands, smiled a bit. The South Korean nation seemed to fall in love with her because she was such a mysterious, powerful princess from the mysterious, backward nation that is North Korea. It was exhilarating. Finally, peace is nigh, many people around the world said. But since the onset of COVID, and Kim Jong-un, we know, is not in optimal health, I think the pandemic was the first ever existential threat that Kim Jong-un has ever experienced in his very pampered and spoiled life. Because the pandemic, unlike wars or famine, can kill both princes and paupers alike. We've seen Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, come to brush with death. He was seriously ill from COVID. We saw President Trump also quite seriously ill, not to the extent of Johnson. So it was a serious situation, and there was a need to rapidly elevate Kim Jong-un's trusted sister, just in case. Who better to look after Kim Jong-un if he is ill, and his family, his wife and small children, other than his very capable sister? So she assumed the role of the even worse cop to Kim Jong-un's bad cop. And Kim Jong-un, ironically, came across as the more restrained, reasonable person. Kim Yo-jong issued a written formal statement on June 13th in 2020, saying that the Joint Liaison Office, North Korea, South Korea Liaison Tower, a 4-story building inside North Korea, just north of the border, built entirely and maintained entirely with South Korean taxpayer money, that this ugly, useless building will be gone soon. And 3 days later, yes, it was demolished. It was theatrical. It was around 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and they showed the video footage just a few hours later. You can visually see the demolition job. You can see plumes of smoke going up, almost imagining, you can smell it. So there's a visual, obviously auditory, you can hear the bang, and even an olfactory impact. It's visually arresting and disturbing. So after that, in the same June 13th statement, she also threatened to deploy troops into the border region next to South Korea. And then a few days later, Kim Jong-un said during a party meeting, that plan, deploying troops, we're going to suspend that for now. Wait, thus coming across as the more reasonable person. And this is my last point. So since then, Kim Yo-jong has been the even worse cop. She's issued over 40 statements deriding various leaders, including President Biden, calling all kinds of nasty names for the South Korean leader, the current president, and his predecessor, and so on. But there will come a time when North Korea reverts to a post-provocation peace ploy, a charm, offensive. They go through cycles. And that will cause another dramatic expectation of rapprochement, peace, reconciliation, and all those good things. And by virtue of her identity, a young, powerful woman, if she says, when she says, let's talk, whether it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump in the White House next year, when Kim Yo-jong calls for peace talks, I think it would be exceedingly difficult, virtually impossible, for the next US administration to say, no, thank you, we're not interested in peace talks. And she has an advantage because there is a latent tendency, and forgive me if I speak out of line, out of place, there is a latent tendency in many men and some women too, I would submit to you, to underestimate smart, ambitious, young women. We will want to think that she's saying all the right things because of my own innate intelligence, charisma, because I've been saying the same things. Finally, I can teach her a lesson. That kind of patronizing attitude works only in North Korea's interest, in their favor. Watch out. Talk to her, yes, but recognize who she is. The number 2 person in arguably the world's most inhumane and the most cruel and the most despotic regime on the face of the planet. Don't underestimate her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thanks a lot. We've learned a lot about North Korea in your remarks, but I wonder, when I read the media and also listen to you, I'm trying to be a little provocative, are we not exaggerating the threat from North Korea? Yes, they are having nuclear weapons, right? But he can't possibly use them without being eliminated himself and his country in a counterstrike. It's terrible for the 25 million people of North Korea, what is going on, starvation, deprivation, and so on. But how dangerous is North Korea really for the wider world? Is the United States threatened by North Korea? Are the Europeans threatened by North Korea, not to speak of China and Russia?
Thank you. Let me ask you, now, as Professor Larres says, we have to reinforce the message that if North Korea even resorts to a very limited nuclear strike on South Korea or its allies, it will be the end of the regime. This is what every US administration, including President Biden, has said over the years repeatedly. This is what every US administration has reinforced to North Korea, the North Korean leader. If you use nukes, then you die. It's the end of your regime. President Clinton, during a visit to South Korea in the summer of 1993, at the demilitarized zone, the border, looking into North Korea, said, unprompted, said, if they use nukes on South Korea, we will erase North Korea from the map. I'm not convinced that is feasible. Killing 25 million innocent civilians, let's say 1 million innocent civilians in Pyongyang. Which nation around the world would endorse, support such mass war crime, the killing of civilians? Rhetorically, I understand we have to keep reinforcing that message to North Korea. Don't do it, don't even think about it. We will end you. But in practice, will France, will the UK applaud? We are still talking about the atomic bombings of Japan in history's greatest war, as we should. We're morally re-examining the decisions, the loss of innocent lives, now decades later. So, if the United States truly is poised to eliminate, exterminate millions of North Korean people, who will say, well done? I don't think it's a feasible option. And I think the North Koreans know that. And again, they have such a higher pain threshold. 1 million people died during the famine, the North Korean famine of the mid to late 1990s. Perhaps 10% of the population died of starvation. And you must be thinking, wow, what a human tragedy. They must have been so poor, they must have been so incompetent that they couldn't feed their own people. As we know, famines have been with us throughout human existence, and famine-like situations we see around the world today, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa. But famines have always taken place in a pre-industrial agriculture-based economies, very poor countries, where adult illiteracy is high, today even as high as 80%, 90%, especially high among the female population in many countries around the world. A society that had not yet reached urbanization or industrialization or adult literacy, and often a country that's beset by internal turmoil, civil war, uprisings, and so on, which of course naturally discourage, depress outside financial investment and so forth. North Korea does not fit that bill. North Korea was richer than the South until about 1973. North Korea became a fully industrialized economy in the mid-1960s. It eradicated adult illiteracy a decade before South Korea did. It became an urbanized, industrialized, literate country, not engaged in active war, yet suffered a nationwide famine throughout the entire nation from 1994 to 1998. At the time, did North Korea not have the money with which to import food, grain? No, they had more than enough money, but chose not to. The defense budget for 1997, according to the US State Department, at the height of the famine, was $6 to $7 billion, a tiny amount to the US defense budget, yes, but more than enough with which to buy food. According to the international price of grain, if North Korea had imported $200 million worth of corn or wheat and distributed it equitably, no man, woman, child would have died. But they chose not to. Instead, Kim Jong-il spent $800 million in refurbishing this giant palace, the most extravagant building in the Korean peninsula, where his father would be lying in state, embalmed, and he would join his father later on. They spent $1.5 billion in purchasing about 40 outdated Soviet MiG warplanes from Ukraine and Kazakhstan. So they had more than enough money with which to import food and distribute that import, chose not to. To this day, they don't. To this day, North Korea is one of the worst food insecure nations, according to the United Nations. So there's an element of cruelty in all this. North Korea uses food as both a spear and a shield. That is, a shield against criticisms from the outside world of their human rights violations, and a spear with which to try to extort the international community for free food.
Thank you very much. It's very illuminating. There are lots of sanctions on North Korea, lots of other attempts to undermine North Korea's nuclear program above all. But how does the regime actually obtain money? Where does it get its money from? We know by criminal, illegal activities. Can you tell us how Kim manages to get hold of millions and millions of money to furnish his palaces, his nuclear program, and so on? How does he get the money?
Thank you. By 1973, North Korea had become totally credit unworthy. That is, it had defaulted on every single loan it had borrowed from sovereign states, from international financial institutions, and no country was willing to lend money to North Korea. So what did they do? They became a giant criminal syndicate. They began behaving like the mob. For example, producing drugs, illicit drugs, and proliferating illicit drugs around the world. Their accredited diplomats abroad in embassies around the world, they had to resort to criminal activities trafficking in banned animal parts like rhinoceros horn, ivory, trunks, and so on. The diplomats had to sell drugs. The state printed counterfeit US $100 bills. And to this day, they are the best counterfeits in the world. So good that the Treasury Department decades ago came up with the moniker supernotes to refer to North Korean fake Benjamin's $100 bills. This is state-sponsored criminal activity. And this still goes on. But in recent years, they have become very good at cyber theft. According to various reports, North Korea has stolen at least $4 billion worth of cyber currency over the past 2 or 3 years. So they're very good at adaptation, and they operate like a giant mob, criminal syndicate. They show no qualms about their criminal activities committed around the world. Sanctions, there's a lot of misperception about sanctions in general, I feel. During the Cold War, basically all we had was no trade sanctions. Cuba, for example. But Cuba was fine with no exports to the US market, although it's the biggest market, because it traded with basically every country in Europe. US allies in East Asia like Japan and South Korea. So trade sanctions are not effective. They're clunky. They are a relic of the past. But after 9/11, after 2001, the US Treasury Department stumbled upon highly effective sanctions mechanism, that is targeted financial sanctions, not only against your primary target, which in those days was Al-Qaeda, but also third countries, third parties that trade with, that barter with, that do business with the primary target, called secondary sanctions. So the Obama administration, in trying to get Iran back to the negotiating table, went after not only Iranian entities, but banks, companies, international legitimate banks and companies in allied nations like France, Switzerland, Japan, the UK, levying fines in the case of the biggest bank in France, $9 billion. And the banks pay. They always pay. Why? Because the alternative is to be kicked out of the US financial system, the world's golden primary currency. And that is a death knell if you are a major financial institution or corporation. They levied, the Obama administration levied $300 million fine on the Bank of Japan, over $600 million on ING, Barclays of London, and so on, about $2 million on Commerzbank. And Iran did come back to the negotiating table. But no such sanctions enforcement have ever been implemented against North Korea and North Korea's many known partners, so which are basically Chinese and Russian entities.
Why not?
For various reasons, because the US deems it to be not in the best interest of the United States to be in a fight with China. This is before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But in the past, when the Treasury Department blacklisted a small bank in Macau called Banco Delta Asia, this was back in 2005, there were about $25 million worth of North Korean held funds. There was a run on the bank. Depositors withdrew their money because they didn't want to come under the scrutiny of the US Treasury Department. And North Korea felt very vulnerable in those days. But after North Korea's first nuclear test the next year in 2006, the Bush administration returned the money to North Korea, not only said, okay, it's not tainted money anymore, in our opinion, you can withdraw it. North Korea insisted that the US prove it to the world that it's not dirty money. How? By wiring it through the US Federal Reserve in New York City, and then remitting it, sending it to a bank in the Russian Far East, and then on to North Korea. And it was done for the sake of nuclear diplomacy. But the point here is, if you don't enforce sanctions, like domestic law enforcement, if the FBI or the police give up on surveillance, monitoring criminal activities, activities by, say, a criminal syndicate, then even the toughest laws on the books have no meaning if you don't enforce the law. Likewise with sanctions, even if you have tough sanctions, if very few nation states are interested in doing their part, due diligence, monitoring, surveillance, and imposing fines, sanctions have no meaning. And there was not a single United Nations Security Council sanctions against North Korea until North Korea's first nuclear test in 2006. There was not a single North Korea-specific US sanctions legislation, no American North Korea-specific sanctions law until 2016. So historically, US sanctions against North Korea have been very weak. And
to North Korea also sends workers abroad to earn hard currency, waitresses working in North Korean restaurants in China, yes. Workers slaving away in construction sites. Does that earn a lot of money? Is that just a pittance?
It's not a lot of money. They make far more money by proliferating fake famous brand cigarettes like Marlboro and Dunhill and so on. That's a very lucrative, high payoff investment, fake famous brand cigarettes. They make far more money probably engaging in proliferation of counterfeit US dollars and so on. But it's a stream of income, hard currency for the regime. And even North Korean diplomats stationed abroad, as I mentioned, they not only have to engage in criminal activities, but they have to make donations, contributions to the regime. So even the most elite, the most highly educated, smart people in the foreign ministry, working in embassies around the world, and most European nations have diplomatic relations with North Korea, although not every nation hosts a North Korean embassy or a consulate. Even they live on pittance, a few dollars a month, even an ambassador.
I understand that North Korean embassies are supposed to be self-financing. They're not expecting to get finance from the government in North Korea, but somehow find the money to survive in Berlin, London, and wherever else. Thank you. What about Otto Warmbier? You were involved in that case. You were an expert witness testifying about the nature of the North Korean regime. We know that was a very sad case. Perhaps you can briefly summarize the case as such, and also your involvement and how you think how that came about, what the North Korea regime did to Otto Warmbier.
Yes, Otto Warmbier was a student at UVA who, on a group tour visit to North Korea in late 2015, and was accused of the crime of, quote, under the guise of a tourist with supervision of the CIA, having entered North Korea to undermine the fundamental unity of the North Korean government, meaning to topple the regime. It's an absurd accusation made formally in the Korean Central News Agency dispatch of January 21st. He was apprehended as he was about to leave North Korea along with his fellow travelers on January 2nd, 2016. He was a top student, an athlete, very popular, very smart young man who had a bright future ahead of him. He was to work on Wall Street in Manhattan that summer. He was very curious about the world, so he had traveled to Cuba with his mother previously, and he wanted to, experience North Korea, this very strange country. I argued in the court hearing at the district court in Washington, D.C. in December 2018, the family sued the DPRK, North Korea, because Otto was detained and then he was forced to undergo a bogus confession on Leap Day on February 29th that year in 2016, and he was clearly rattled and scared. And it was clear to me that the North Koreans had basically written the statement. There were unidiomatic, strange North Korean verbiage, North Korean English expressions. There was also a lot of North Korean verbiage referring to themselves as the DPRK, not as North Korea. And Otto was valiantly trying to signal to his parents, to his family back home, that this is all coerced. For example, he misstated the name of his father's family, and he said 3 times that his father went bankrupt, that they are in grave financial distress. That's why his Methodist church offered him $200,000 because he desperately needed a car, and he had to pay for the tuition of his younger siblings. So on the promise of $200,000, which the CIA had financed, this was the confession, that Otto agreed to enter North Korea and try to insult North Korea. It's all bogus. The family was not bankrupt, quite affluent, successful businessman. He was a Jew, never attended church. He had a car, certainly didn't need a car living in Manhattan that summer, as was the plan. So he was trying to tell his family that all this is coerced, it's bogus, and he was clearly scared. We don't know exactly what North Korea did to Otto, but for the sake of the lawsuit, and the lawsuit was made possible because President Trump, the previous year in November 2017, had relisted North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism, and that allows US persons, US citizens and lawful permanent citizens, residents, to sue a sovereign state like North Korea because the US government regards North Korea as a terrorism sponsoring state, and Iran as well. Many victims of Iranian terrorism have sued Iran, and they've won in court and have been awarded compensation money. And Otto, we didn't know his condition thereafter until June the next year. For almost 18 months, the family of Otto Warmbier were told by the US government, including the State Department, don't cause a scene, don't say anything negative about North Korea. Eventually, they'll let Otto go. They usually do, which is true, but there are exceptions. But whatever they did, presumably torturing Otto Warmbier, Otto was returned to the United States, brain dead, not in peaceful coma, asleep, but writhing in pain, blind, deaf, mute, and wailing in pain, and brain dead. According to medical experts, we examined Otto. North Korea did something that blocked blood flow to his brain for at least 20 minutes, rendering him brain dead. For the sake of the lawsuit, which is not a criminal case, it's
deliberate, or do you think that might have been an accident which they didn't intend to do?
We don't know. We don't know. But from the evidence, what we reasonably can assume is they tortured him. For example, his lower middlemost teeth, 2 teeth, they had been plucked with pliers and then reinserted, presumably before he was released, about ½ inch behind where the correct position is. And that's a common North Korean torture technique, just pulling out teeth. Otto also had a never before seen scar, about a 4-inch scar on his left foot, presumably another typical North Korean torture technique. They planted an electrode to administer electric shock. There is an eyewitness, another US prisoner, who saw Otto Warmbier being dragged from one torture room to another, completely wet, being just dragged. He's basically like, completely unconscious, waterboarding, we must assume. But although we don't know exactly what they did, whether it was intentional or not, he was rendered brain dead. And for the sake of the lawsuit, which is again not a criminal lawsuit, which has a higher bar of the burden of proof, beyond a reasonable doubt, this was a civil lawsuit. And we don't need to establish, the court does not need to establish exactly what they did and what kind of intent was behind it. The result was apparent. They did something to render him brain dead, whether it's intentional, whether it was first degree, secondary, involuntary homicide, we don't know, but it doesn't matter. They killed him.
Motivation. I mean, Otto Warmbier was not a high-profile prisoner. He was not an important person in politics or economics. He was just a young man who was traveling in North Korea. He did something which the North Koreans regarded as illegal by trying to remove a poster from the wall, but it was, even that wasn't a major crime. So what was the motivation to treat him so terribly as you just described it? This doesn't really make any sense at all, does it?
This is what I argued in court in Washington, D.C., in my written declaration and at the hearing. In 2009, in March 2009, North Korea detained 2 US citizens, young female reporters, Laura Ling, the sister of Lisa Ling, who's a famous TV personality, and her colleague, fellow reporter Yuna Lee, so a Chinese American and Korean American. And they beat Laura with the butt of a rifle, and she thought she was going to die. She told me in person. And they eventually released them when former President Bill Clinton flew in early August 2009. In 2009, this is the first year of the Obama presidency. Whereas, by virtue of Senator Obama during the campaign the previous year, having said that if he's elected, he'll reach out, he'll talk to the dictator of North Korea, with the Iranian leader and so on. And therefore, whereas people thought that Kim Jong-il, the North Korean leader, would try to seize upon that goodwill, that opportunity, and not cause problems, I maintained in 2009 that North Korea will come out swinging. You have a relatively young, inexperienced politician in President Obama. You have 2 unpopular wars going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. You have an unprecedented, in some years, global financial crisis. What better time than to put maximum pressure on the new US president? And again, that's what they did. They conducted the first long-range missile test on April 5th in 2009, early in the Obama administration, and then the nuclear test on Memorial Day. That's what they do. So as they are planning, and this is not impulsive, they plan for these things, of course. What better than to have 2 US hostages as you are planning for major provocations against the young new US administration in 2009. Likewise, in 2016, North Korea was planning for all kinds of more serious provocations. Just 4 days after they captured Otto, on January 6, 2016, they conducted another nuclear test. They knew that there was in Congress a bill, a North Korea-specific sanctions legislation that was going to pass. So new form of financial pressure was coming their way. Okay, let's have a US hostage. They were planning for the first ever submarine-launched ballistic missile test, which came in late April 2016. They were planning for another nuclear test, which came on Nation Founding Day on September 9th, another submarine-launched ballistic missile test in August that year. So as they are planning for relentless provocations, new weapons tests, why not have an extra layer of security blanket in the form of a US person, a US citizen, as a hostage? It's, I suppose, sort of in a mean kind of sinister way, rational kind of line of thinking.
I understand, but it still doesn't explain why they treated him so badly. If they want to have a hostage, you don't murder the hostage because that is the opposite what you want to achieve. But I guess this is the enigma, the riddle we can't resolve. Let me go on. Let me ask maybe 2 more questions before we open it up to questions from you, the audience. North Korea plays a role increasingly in the war, Russia's onslaught on Ukraine. You said in conversation earlier that you would not be surprised if there were soon to be seen North Korean soldiers fighting on Russia's side in the Ukraine war. How do you come to that conclusion, and what is the situation? How much help and support is North Korea providing to Russia, or is that support exaggerated in the Western media?
Kim Jong-un suffered undoubtedly his first public humiliation at the hands of President Donald Trump at their second summit meeting, which took place in Hanoi in Vietnam in late February 2019. What I mean is President Trump, distracted by the congressional hearing testimony of his erstwhile friend and lawyer, Michael Cohen, stayed up all night watching the hearing before the summit. His mind was back in Washington, D.C., and when he couldn't reach a satisfactory deal with Kim Jong-un, President Trump canceled lunch, canceled a signing ceremony. There was no agreement to sign, but he canceled lunch and got on Air Force One and left, thus rendering Kim Jong-un as sort of a tourist who has time on his hands. So he was not happy about that, Kim Jong-un. And during the 70-hour-long train ride back home, he had everyone on the train except for his sister punished, kneel down and raise their arms. For how long? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? No, the entire duration of the train ride. So when he visited Russia for the first time as the supreme leader and met Putin for the first time, which was on April 25th, same year in 2019 in Vladivostok, his major deputies who had participated in the Hanoi summit, many were excluded. Even his sister did not accompany him, and that's the first and only time that the sister was not present at a summit meeting by Kim Jong-un. And when Kim Jong-un arrived in his Mercedes-Benz, Putin uncharacteristically was on time. He was waiting there. He's infamous for showing up late, Putin, to summit meetings, keeping people waiting 2 hours, 3 hours, and so on. And the meeting did not go well. Kim Jong-un felt insulted, and I think Putin meant to insult him, because it was 2:05 when they shook hands in the afternoon. By the time they had a talk and even a banquet dinner and said goodbye, it was still light out. It was about 6:20 p.m., just 4 hours later. And during the meeting, Putin told Kim that, hello, I'm taking off for China tomorrow to attend the second Belt and Road Initiative conference in Beijing. So have a good time in my country. It's a breach of diplomatic protocol. When you have a head of state visiting you, you normally don't take a flight out of your own country, thus rendering the visitor like a tourist. So Kim Jong-un felt very insulted. He was angry, went back to his facility, and after having drunk copious amounts of wine at the banquet, he finished a whole bottle of vodka by himself and showed up 2 hours, 40 minutes late to his first event the next day, a wreath-laying ceremony at a martyr's cemetery, and then canceled the rest of the day. He went home, canceled a visit to the zoo, a ballet in the evening. He felt offended. But the second summit that took place to this day, a year ago to this day, on September 13th, since it's already September 13th in East Asia, in Vladivostok, not Vladivostok, in the Russian Far East, at the Space Dome, the body language and everything was entirely new, very different. Both dictators seemed happy to be reunited, to see each other. And Putin at the summit said, we are here to help North Korea launch satellite, meaning to help them with their long-range ballistic missile capabilities. And soon thereafter, North Korea started to send Russia, to this day, over 12,000 containers, carrying what? One assumes not food or medicine. Artillery shells, short-range missiles. How many? According to the South Korean government, as of June, 5 million shells. This morning I mentioned 1 million, but I was mistaken. 5 million shells. To put that in some context, that's 10 times more than what the West, including the US, has supplied Ukraine. So Putin needs Kim as much as Kim needs Putin right now. But that doesn't mean that this romance will last forever. But for now, Putin is intimating that he is willing to provide sensitive nuclear technology to Kim, and Kim is going all out trying to please Putin. And this is concerning to Washington because we don't know where this military collusion ends. At what point does it stop? Will Russia actually provide a nuclear blueprint for building a nuclear-powered submarine to North Korea? Will they help with ICBM technology? We don't know. So this is causing a gnawing, kind of a slow-lasting, long-lasting worry in certain circles in the United States government. And that's a psychological game that the two dictators are playing. And Putin, although he endorsed all previous 10 UN Security Council resolutions penalizing North Korea, banning the development and testing of ballistic missiles, Putin's like, oh, no problem. There has not been a single United Nations new resolution out of the Security Council since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, although North Korea has conducted well over 100 ballistic missile tests since. So even with a nuclear test, the next nuclear test, there won't even be a tap on the wrist for Kim Jong-un because Putin and to a lesser extent China are protecting North Korea.
That brings me to a question regarding China. We would usually assume if China wanted to, it could rein in North Korea and Kim. The Chinese themselves say, the West, you overestimate our influence on North Korea. What do you think is correct? Do we really overestimate the influence, or does China simply not want to rein in North Korea?
There is truth and falsehood in both positions. China can, yes, exert the most pressure on North Korea out of any country in the world, but it is also true that the North Koreans don't really listen to Chinese admonition. They do as they will. And they, including Kim Il-sung, the founder, his son Kim Jong-il, and this leader, Kim Jong-un, the three generations of Kims have repeatedly defied China's top leader, not only defiance, but insulted the Chinese top leader repeatedly. And the Chinese grow irate, of course. They don't like it, but they calm down, and usually they revert to a greater aid package for North Korea, just to keep North Korea within their orbit, their sphere of influence. And that is realpolitik if you are China. Why kill North Korea? That is the most useful political card vis-a-vis the far greater strategic competitor in the United States. So historically, when the North Koreans insult Mao or Deng Xiaoping or Hu Jintao or Xi Jinping, they grow irate. They sort of degrade their bilateral relationship as evinced by the frequency of exchange of letters and personnel, but in the end, go back to supporting North Korea. I mentioned the third nuclear test, which came on February 12, 2013, during the Chinese Lunar New Year holiday. Xi Jinping was incensed. He told President Obama, as President Obama said, things that the Chinese have never told the US president. According to President Obama, President Xi said, I'm going to teach that son of a bitch a lesson. That's verbatim quote of what President Obama said. I'm going to teach that son of a bitch a lesson. Did he? No. I respectfully, but honestly, submitted my views to President Obama in the White House at this rare privilege of advising him. No. They will increase aid to North Korea. China will. And indeed, two-way trade for that year, 2013, hit an all-time high of $6.5 billion. To this day, that's a record. So China was overly generous, even after having been insulted and having grown indignant. And, that is good politics from the Chinese point of view, I suppose.
Thank you. So there's no hope that the North Korean regime will collapse anytime soon, that perhaps a country will collapse because of economic problems, or that the Kim family will fall out with each other and fight each other, and that the regime will be undermined from within, and we basically see Korean unification with South Korea coming out on top.
Well, Professor Larres, as you know, the decline and fall of regimes, including small city-states and even empires, is a recurring theme in history. One cannot rule it out. And North Korea is a state, a regime in extremis, kept together, maintained by extreme measures like public executions and political prisoner concentration camps terrorizing the population. One cannot rule out an uprising one day, or even a lone, perhaps adventurous person trying to take out the supreme leader. One cannot rule it out, but as far as I can tell, there are no such indications, no signs of any regime instability. And this is kind of a feat, achievement. The fact that with such contradictions and cruel elements in governance, that they have kept the country together, impervious to outside influences, largely speaking. But how long can it last? I don't know.
Thanks very much. Let's open it up to questions. I'm sure you have plenty of questions after this very enlightening talk. Let's take you here at the front. Yeah.
I got here a little bit late, so you might have already answered this, but is the North Korean regime still at all concerned with unifying the Korean Peninsula, or is it sort of solely focused on its own survival? And depending on the answer to this question, how should that inform our policy towards North Korea?
No, just.
Forgive me. I find myself these days saying strangely annoying things like, when I was your age. But when I was your age, when I was in college, this is a true story, my roommate, my good friend, Victor, one afternoon said, hey, let's go to a buffet, eat to excess. I think the real wording was, let's pig out, and then go bar hopping. And as a person not entirely opposed to that kind of sybaritic lifestyle, I just wanted to be mean. And I said, hey, Victor, is that really necessary? And then my good friend, he grew indignant and turned to me and said, are you really necessary? Is my existence on Earth really necessary? Ever since, I've been grappling with this existential question. I mean, what is my purpose in life? I mean, will the cosmos cease to exist if I disappear? If you were to pose that rather impolite question to North Korea's supreme leader, sir, why are you really necessary? Why is the despotic People's Republic, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, really necessary when you have a very successful, very pleasant, prosperous Korean state in South Korea? You have, if you are the North Korean leader, as secure as you are today, a long-term existential threat in the sheer existence of a thriving, rich, free Korean state across its southern border. So the ultimate supreme national task, quote, supreme national task of reunification, as stipulated in North Korea's constitution, is not just a wild, ambitious dream, but a supreme national mission to take over South Korea's people and its territory, to finish the job that the grandfather had started with the invasion of the South in 1950. It's not a pipe dream. How do you achieve that? Well, they have the military power with which to do it, but the US stands in the way. I think they've been trying very hard. As of early 1970s, 1972, North Korea has repeatedly called on the US to sign a peace treaty. The Korean War ended with a temporary armistice, not a formal peace treaty, so technically we're still at war. But in the end, these are just a piece of paper. You have to enforce them. You have to abide by these agreements. So what does a peace treaty achieve? Why does North Korea want a peace treaty with the US when North Korea claims that it was victorious, that it defeated the US? Because a peace treaty would immediately render the presence of the United Nations Command in South Korea null and void. The United Nations Command was formed in the crucible in the wake of North Korea's invasion to defend the South. Legally, the UN Command would have to cease to exist. And then the thorny question of the continued presence of US troops in South Korea. Why are they there? Why are our boys and girls there? Why are soldiers still in South Korea when we have a peace treaty with North Korea? Bring them home or deploy them elsewhere. Who will say such things? North Korea, of course, Russia, China, but also South Koreans and Americans. So a peace treaty sounds very tantalizing. We all want permanent peace, but it can be a historical canard. It can be sort of a non-aggression pact signed by the Soviet Union and Germany, which led to war a year later. It can be a ruse. And what North Korea seeks is the Vietnam model of becoming a political, economic, but mostly political burden to the US administration after years of fighting, and then suing for a peace treaty, and then rendering the South vulnerable and marching in with tanks rolling. I think that's what North Korea has in mind. And how do you achieve that? Well, you become a constant, imminent nuclear threat to the US mainland. And North Korea has made great progress, strides in becoming that kind of a constant nuclear threat with its ballistic missile capabilities development and nuclear weapons development.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, please. Can people also, when they speak, introduce themselves briefly, their name and affiliation, please?
Thank you. My name is Dr. Michael Fitzpatrick. We met earlier at the lunch session, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at UNC-Chapel Hill. And I wanted to circle back to the conversation you two were having about China and North Korea. It seems these days that a lot of strategic thinking in many countries across East Asia is on the Taiwan contingency and the possibility of war between the United States and China over Taiwan. And I wondered how North Korea would fit into this situation. Particularly, how do North Koreans see their role in a potential war between China and the United States? You were at the end talking about North Korea and Russia. It seems almost as if that may be a hedge against, as well, unwanted Chinese policy, if you would agree with that proposition. Thank you.
Thank you. We have seen instability in the Taiwan Strait in the past, as you well know, Dr. Fitzpatrick. In 1954, 1955, and then in 1958 and 1996 during the Clinton administration and so on. In those days, especially in the 1950s, China did not have nuclear weapons, as we know. First developed the bomb in 1964 and then the hydrogen bomb 3 years later. Yet, Chinese leaders like Chairman Mao, Deng De-Huai, the commander in the Korean War, the defense minister, would say things to Soviet leaders like Khrushchev and others, strange sounding things like, yes, the American imperialists have nuclear weapons, we don't, but we have the spirit of the bomb, nuclear weapons. They kill 300 million of us, we'll soon go back to making babies, we'll be okay. And the Russians were kind of scared by that kind of crazy sounding rhetoric. The Chinese came across to Russian ears as incapable of appreciating the awesome, devastating power of nuclear weapons. But I think the Chinese were, tongue-in-cheek saying those things. We will stand up to the Americans. Likewise, the North Koreans have been saying basically the same things before they went nuclear, because they had essentially fought the United States to a draw with a lot of help from China in the Korean War. Does an instability in the Taiwan Strait please North Korea? Decidedly so, I would say, because even the question of the role of the US troops in South Korea, will they be siphoned off or a contingency in defending Taiwan, will have to come under question. Even US forces in Japan, will they participate in any disaster relief, humanitarian aid operations, maybe even combat operations? These are all sensitive questions to which there are no firm answers, but we have to start thinking seriously about such an alternative future. So I believe that North Korea would be quite pleased if there is a situation in Taiwan, around Taiwan, and would use that opportunity to put pressure on South Korea, the United States, US presence in South Korea. Beyond just circumspection or speculation, what is the basis for my views? Well, it sort of happened during Vietnam. And when the Vietnam War truly became a political burden for the Lyndon Johnson administration as of early 1968 with the Tet Offensive, that's when North Korea came out swinging against South Korea and the US. For example, this is before the Tet Offensive, a few days before, but on January 21st, 1968, North Korea had dispatched commandos, elite commandos, highly trained 31 commandos to South Korea for the express mission of assassinating the South Korean president. They had come very close to the presidential estate, and they sort of stood out as not South Korean. So somebody reported them, and the police and the military came, and there was a shootout. Most North Korean commandos were killed in the confrontation with the South Korean military. Two managed to escape back to North Korea and were treated as heroes. One was captured and is still living. So thanks to him, we know a lot about the mission, North Korea's intentions. 2 days later, in a premeditated, well-planned operation, North Korean torpedo boats attacked a clunky US spy ship called the USS Pueblo in international waters on the east coast of North Korea, clearly in international waters. There were helicopters shooting at the ship, and one sailor was killed in this attack, and the surviving 82 sailors of the USS Pueblo were detained for 11 months in North Korea. The ship's still there, and they were tortured repeatedly, and so on. North Korea dispatched hundreds of commandos into South Korea later in the same year, 1968. President Johnson in April, in a TV live press conference, said he would not seek the nomination of his party. So North Korea has a good, keen sense of timing, knowing that the US would not be able to prosecute two simultaneous wars in Asia or around the world. And this is, intercepted in conversations between various world leaders. They say things like the US is a paper tiger after all. Look what the North Koreans are doing. The next year, early in the new Nixon administration, on Kim Il-sung's birthday, April 15th, North Korea, again, premeditated, well-prepared mission attack. There was a clunky US reconnaissance plane that took off from Japan around 1 p.m. Routine surveillance of the east coast of North Korea in international airspace. 2 North Korean MiGs tailed it, shot it down, killing all 31 servicemen on board. No reprisal whatsoever, because the Nixon administration couldn't risk another war erupting against North Korea as the war in Vietnam was going on. And more such attacks against US troops in South Korea, killing of South Koreans and Americans for the rest of the year.
I was told Americans or American policymakers like to find solutions rather than sit it out and wait forever. So what can be done? If you had to give advice to President Biden, as you gave advice to President Obama, contradicting him even, what to do about North Korea rather than let it go on for 20 or 30 years? Is there a solution possible, at least in theory, or do you say it's such an intractable problem, nothing can really be done?
10 years ago, I kept arguing that we have to enforce sanctions, targeted financial sanctions, going after North Korea's partners as well. Well, that never materialized. Although in 2017, we had the toughest enforcement of sanctions against North Korea because of North Korea's relentless provocations. Even semi-neutral states like Italy, Spain, Kuwait, they expelled the North Korean ambassador in their home nation. It's a symbolic act, but kind of embarrassing for North Korea. But there's nothing even remotely resembling that today in terms of sanctions enforcement. So I think that opportunity is behind us now to putting real financial pressure on North Korea.
Nothing can be done.
Well, deterrence. Deterrence, through action, defensive military drills, combined military drills, not only between the US and South Korea, but with Japanese participation, as we've seen over the past 2 years, with Australia, New Zealand, other US partners and allies in the region, and sending a firm message to North Korea: don't do it, don't escalate, because we will fight, we will stand up to you. And maintaining the imperfect, very much imperfect, but the de facto actual peace in the Korean Peninsula. In the 60-year period leading up to the outbreak of the Korean War, there are 4 major wars that engulf the Korean Peninsula. Since 1953, the armistice, there's been no war. Again, very much imperfect, shaky peace, but actual peace. That is preferable to a full-blown war.
Thank you. Any more questions? Oh, I'm sorry, here.
Hello. I'm an undergraduate student, Professor Larres at UNC-Chapel Hill. My question was, earlier you spoke about the North Koreans being engaged in cybercrime with the theft of a huge amount of digital currency. Do you believe the North Korean state has a significant threat to U.S. infrastructure or other strategic interests through cyber warfare? Does it have that kind of capability?
Yes, I do. In 2014, North Korea set sort of a record, I suppose. It was unprecedented. North Korea effected the first ever instance of compelling a US corporation, a corporation on US territory, to self-censorship through cyber terrorism by threatening to blow up movie complexes, including malls and other businesses in the vicinity, any movie theater that would air, that would show this silly satirical film making fun of Kim Jong-un called The Interview. They made that threat after establishing credibility, if you will, after causing at least $300 million of kinetic damage to Sony Pictures Entertainment, their computer systems and so forth, as well as PR damage, embarrassment by releasing sensitive comments by Hollywood A-list actors and actresses, saying unkind things about each other. So that was a massive cyber attack against Sony Pictures Entertainment. And when Sony went ahead and said, we will release this movie on a certain date, North Korea said, we will blow you up. It was a completely empty threat. In the United States, there are no North Korean terrorist cells. The US does not maintain diplomatic relations with North Korea, and that means there are very, very, very few North Koreans. Only North Korean officials accredited to the DPRK mission at the United Nations in New York City and their family. So we're talking about a dozen, under fewer than 20 North Korean officials residing in the United States, and they are under a 25-mile radius travel ban. Yes, there are North Korean sympathizers and partners perhaps, but still in the US, we're pretty safe from North Korea's malign designs. So it set an unprecedented and unfortunate, precedent of self-censorship in the face of North Korean cyber threat. We know that North Korea has caused massive damage to the British national health system with cyber attacks. We know that North Korea has stolen $81 million from the Central Bank of Bangladesh a few years ago. We know that they've attacked various government facilities, military installations in the United States and South Korea already. So they have one of the world's most advanced cyber capabilities. Again, we tend to patronize North Korea, so we can't imagine that they are so good at such complex technology. But after US, China, Russia, and maybe a couple of other countries, it's North Korea. So again, it doesn't help to underestimate North Korea because they have nuclear weapons and cyber capabilities.
Fine, yeah.
An extraordinary talk, thank you. Following up on
Kilev is one of our loyal Krasno followers and supporters. Thank you.
one of the groupies, yes. So you've laid out these things, but it's so complicated. And you said, well, the US didn't respond, didn't reciprocate when Pueblo was held. You talk about the plane was shot down. And then Professor Larres said, well, what should the US policy be? And if I were in the president's office and I was talking to you, I would like some clarity on what to do. I mean, it's so confusing. So that's one question. Another one, it was really alarming to hear that the possibility of North Korea sending, and you say they don't care about casualties, 300,000 troops to go and fight against Ukraine. How do you see this then unfolding in that whole conflict? And then last part and third question, if they are so sophisticated in their IT and so forth, what is the education system in North Korea? What are they doing with their young people? I mean, all these young ones, these are the change, these are the rebels, these are the people that are going to cause change in this country, all these youngsters around here. What's happening to the youth in North Korea? There we are, 3 questions.
Let me try to address your questions in reverse order with a third one. First, North Korea is one of the most highly educated nations on earth. Their education is weird. There's a lot of wasted time in having to memorize the great wisdom, the great words of the supreme leader. About 1/3 of the college curriculum is devoted to memorizing what Kim Il-sung said and wrote and so on. But they are a very disciplined workforce, and North Korea is good at recruiting very promising children who are good at math, sciences, or the national task of becoming cyber warriors, nuclear scientists, and so on. So although it's a relatively small population of 25 or 26 million, it's not tiny. You know, it's not like a nation of 5 million people or 3 million people. And they produce these very capable technicians and scientists and so on. And it's not surprising because you see South Korea. South Korea is very big on education as well as are Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, China, and others in the region. So the emphasis on hard work, studying hard, and so forth has national policy implications for all countries, I suppose, in varying degrees. But when it comes to North Korea, they handpick children with potential in their weapons development in defense industries. So it doesn't come as a surprise that they can produce such capable, you know, computer wizards and so on. They often come in first or second in international math competitions, North Korean students. So they're very clever. In terms of your second question, which was
Troops in Russia.
right. I don't think North Korea will be brazen enough to just outright send 10,000 or 50,000 soldiers into combat operations right away. They will be dispatched as technicians or medics or, you know, construction workers, and then gradually participate in combat operations. What is my basis for that prognostication? We saw it in Vietnam. North Korean pilots, North Korean soldiers, to a limited extent, were dispatched to help the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. And again, there's a very, I would say, compelling need for Kim Jong-un to help Putin's war campaign in Ukraine for his own benefit. It's a good time for Kim Jong-un to be cozy, to become buddy-buddies with the Russian dictator, because again, Putin seems to need Kim Jong-un quite a bit these days. How long this partnership lasts is anyone's guess, but for now, it's here to stay for the foreseeable future, for the next few months or even a year or more. In terms of your first question, so what can we do to change North Korea? Well, various attempts have been made, of course, placating North Korea, being generous to North Korea. South Korea has given North Korea at least $20 billion worth of aid, most of that in cash. Very goodwill, very much goodwill, but what they did with the cash, we can guess. So they haven't, you know, spent the money with which to help the hungry, suffering people of North Korea. So it's a problem, intractable problem, but what we really can improve in terms of our approach, 2 things I'll mention. Information operations. You know, it's a basic universal freedom, the right to receive and share, impart information, regardless of frontiers, borders, regardless of the medium. This is enshrined in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The drafters were very prescient to say, irrespective of borders and irrespective of the medium. And back then you had what, radio, TV, newspaper, that's it. They could never have imagined our day today. So it's a universal freedom to receive and share information, basic information, and the regime does its best to stifle, to block out outside information so that the people don't know, don't learn how underprivileged, how terrorized they are compared with the rest of the world. We can do a lot more. You know, the US budget for Voice of America and Radio Free Asia, which, as many of you know, are US government agencies, broadcasting news, not just propaganda, but real news to autocracies, over 50 dictatorships around the world, including Russia, of course, Tibet, Burma, Myanmar, North Korea, and so on. The budget for North Korea for Korean language service is woefully low, of both VOA and RFA, lower, about $2 million lower than the US budget for Tibet. Now, it's impolite to make these comparisons, but North Korea is the most systematically information-deprived nation on earth. You can do a lot more to broadcast information, radio broadcasts and through other media into North Korea so that the people find out basic facts about their relative standing to the rest of the world.
Former President Trump was much derided when he met with Kim several times. Was that a good idea and a good approach, or was that to be seen it would be counterproductive? You know, rewarding Kim with a visit before Kim had to give something in return. It doesn't seem to make sense, but what is your judgment about?
So after having softened up South Korea with Kim Yo-jong's visit to South Korea in February for the Winter Games, Kim Jong-un invited South Korean principals, the foreign minister, the national security advisor, the head of the intelligence service, to his own mansion and wined and dined them on Monday, March 5th, 2018, and told the South Koreans, I want to meet President Trump. The South Koreans were elated, delighted to carry that news, and flew into Washington that Thursday on March 8th, 2018, and told President Trump to his face, Kim Jong-un seeks a summit meeting with you. On the spot, President Trump said, okay, the sooner the better, let's do it by May. And that was announced to the world. I realized at that moment that President Trump had walked right into this elaborate trap that Kim Jong-un had laid by sending his sister to South Korea, by coming across as genuinely interested in rapprochement. And President Trump, due to no fault of his own on this account, with no knowledge of North Korean history and strategy, perhaps by hubris, he said, okay, let's do it. And later on, he said things like, I can size him up in a minute or two, and he'll respect me, and so on. What that achieved was the complete loosening of sanctions enforcement against North Korea. Most UN member states, nation states, don't have a dog in this fight. They don't care. And sanctions enforcement it's laborious. You have to put down the resources, manpower to do surveillance, go after North Korea's illicit activities. It's hard work, and most nation states aren't willing to do it unless there's political pressure. And that political pressure had been lifted by the President of the United States. So what did North Korea gain over the next 18 months or so when North Korea refrained from shooting ballistic missiles? That's a small win for Team America. No ballistic missiles test for the next 18 months, year and a half. But I would argue North Korea gained far more in buying time and money in the form of loose to non-sanctions enforcement against North Korea, time and money with which to build more bombs, which they have done. So diplomacy is always to be preferred over war, yes, but sometimes diplomacy comes with a cost, sometimes critical cost.
Thank you very much. We have time for one or two questions if you haven't already exhausted our knowledge about North Korea. Is there an urgent final question? There we are, there Brian again.
Let us in on your secrets. Where do you get your information about what's going on in North Korea?
It's all in my own imagination. I just see things. No. Well, you know, I was born in South Korea, educated in South Korea as a boy, as a young person. So, you know, I read Korean. So I read North Korean propaganda, and usually it's mind numbing, but I've been doing it for 25 years. So I can sort of read behind the lines, as can many other colleagues who do such things. So you can see when North Korea even adumbrates hints at their next move from time to time. And you can see what they're trying to achieve by denouncing South Korea or the US in a certain way. So, you know, it's very shaky, but I do read North Korean official statements. I've watched, probably with exaggeration, 500 hours of North Korean video documentaries in preparing to write my humble book on Kim Il-jung. And one can glean things like during summit meetings, Kim Jong-un and his sister are constantly stealing glimpses of each other during official meetings throughout the day. Like, I mean, they really have rapport and trust in each other. And for example, at the first summit meeting with the then South Korean President Moon at the Inter-Korean border village on April 27, 2018, it was an all-day affair capped by a you know, alcohol-laden banquet, and then an outdoor concert before Kim Jong-un was driven back to Pyongyang. And during the banquet, in Korean culture, when you pull for an older person, higher in rank or age, normally you're expected to pull respectfully, overly respectfully, like this, with two hands, not just with one hand. Kim Jong-un, of course, should have received each pull by South Korean principals like the foreign minister, defense minister, with both hands, like that, but he's the supreme leader. He just holds his hand out like this. He drank probably the equivalent of a full bottle of scotch plus wine, so he's flushed in the face. Kim Il-jung looks happy too. She drank a bit, but not nearly as much as her brother. And then in the North Korean video, it shows that everyone, including Kim Jong-un, his wife, the South Korean president and his wife, everyone is seated in the outdoor makeshift bench with Kim Jong-un and the South Korean president in the middle. And the last person to exit the banquet hall building is none other than his sister. And it seems she has all the time in the world. Everyone's waiting for her to take her seat. She doesn't rush. In Korean culture, if you're not the head person and you're delaying an official event, you show contrition, you normally run, hurry. No, very casually walks down. None of the North Korean officials, including Kim Jong-un, give her a dirty look. They don't even look at her. And she casually takes her position in the front row, and then the concert begins. In North Korean system, in the North Korean hierarchy, that is real power. To be able to behave like that in the presence of the supreme leader. You know what one of the formal allegations against their uncle, who was executed in 2018, was? The previously number 2 person, the husband of Kim Jong-il's sister, you know, the uncle, Chang Song-taek, Mr. Chang, along with treason and womanizing. I'm not making this up. One of the formal accusations was, quote, half-heartedly clapping after the supreme leader's speech, half-heartedly clapping. And that's the official English translation by North Korea. And yes, I could see that his days were numbered, because in the presence of Kim Jong-un, the uncle would do this. And clap like this. You know who claps like this? His sister. Sometimes she's the only person in the room with 5,000 people who doesn't clap. She can get away with it. No other person can. That's real power. So one can glean interesting things like that by observing North Korean videos and reading North Korean propaganda, but it is imperfect, very much so. And North Korean studies, of course, is a field riddled with problems and uncertainties because of the opaque nature of the North Korean system.
Has a daughter, isn't she built up as his successor and not the sister eventually?
Possibly, possibly. We don't even know her name. We use a name according to the former NBA Basketball Association professional basketball player, Dennis Rodman, who held this infant girl in his arms in September 2013 when he visited North Korea for the second time. He says the name is Ju-e. We don't know that for sure. I highly doubt that's the name for reasons that are too myopic and complicated for me to explain here, but for the sake of time. But yes, she may be being groomed to be the successor. But you see, it's very clever. North Korea has nothing to lose by showcasing the daughter, who's cute, who's only 10, 11, or 12, and presenting this wholesome family ensemble, the loving father, mother, and the daughter, at a family gathering like an ICBM launch. That was the first time at an ICBM launch that the daughter was unrolled in public in November 2022. And since then, she's been shown in public almost 20 times, almost always in a military event like an inspection of a missile factory and so on. There are some exceptions. So yes, her prominent role it does raise questions, interesting questions. Will we see the first ever female supreme leader of North Korea in the form of Kim Jong-un's sister? The media, international media, and we are interested in, we're piqued by that, interesting question. Whereas, if he has a son, and some think he does, if he were to be seen in public with a son of a similar age, our reaction would be far more negative. We'd be prone to saying things like, those weird people, they're preparing for a fourth father to son, a fourth generation, a third father to son succession. Our response would be less dramatic or melodramatic or sensational. It would be more negative. And by showcasing the daughter, North Korea, Kim Jong-un is signaling to Washington, hello, I'm a dynasty. We're a dynasty. You, Mr. Trump, Mr. Biden, whoever you are, you will be forgotten in 5 years. Whereas my power, my nukes are here to stay, to be passed down to the next generation. That can create some anxiety in Washington because North Korea is basically saying, we have all the time in the world. You, democracies where people, leaders come and go via elections, you don't have all the time in the world. So they're achieving a lot in terms of psychological pressure by playing this game, showcasing the cute daughter, by deflecting international media attention on the more sensational aspect of North Korea instead of their gross human rights violations, and also signaling to Washington and allies that, as long as I'm able to keep my own mortality at bay, I'm going to rule forever.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Many European emperors said that as well, and it didn't happen, as we know. They all, fell.
Life expectancy was shorter.
Exactly. Let's hope for the best regarding North Korea. All the details you have heard and many more can be found in this book. And I know some of you have already started reading it. Some may even have finished the book. Those of you who haven't yet come across the book, I can really recommend it to you. It's a wonderful read. And I think there are very few people in this room who will now clap only half-heartedly. I think you were great.
Thank you.